So I work on Chrome's usable security team, and we work on all sorts of user-facing security features in the Chrome browser. Things like security indicators, permission prompts, settings, warnings, security-focused developer tools. And today I'm going to be talking to you about what I think is one of the biggest and trickiest problems in web security. But first, I want to pause for a second and note that I'm in a room full of security experts, and I would bet that not one of you noticed that there was something kind of funny about that screenshot of Chrome that I showed just a minute ago. Take another look at it. What's funny about this screenshot is the URL. This isn't the real Google blog URL. The blog post that I was showing is actually hosted at blog.google, not google.blog. But if you were looking at a blog post that looked like it came from Google on a google.blog domain, would you know that it wasn't the real Google blog site? Would you be able to tell whether it was a legitimate Google site at all? And perhaps most importantly, would you even be able to expect an average user to be able to tell? In theory, one of the main reasons that web browsers show URLs to users is so that they can identify the website that they're interacting with. So for example, if Alice is going to log into their Google account, Alice can look at the URL bar and see that it says accounts.google.com up there, so that Alice can check that they're logging into the real Google site and not giving up their password to some evil phishing site that's pretending to be Google. And it's not just password phishing. In theory, browsers show URLs to users to help them protect themselves against a wide variety of malicious web activity. Things like social engineering, deception and misinformation, websites that are trying to take advantage of powerful web permissions like geolocation, all sorts of scams. But in practice, it turns out that even though URLs are great for lots and lots of things, like sharing and navigation and linking to content, they're not that great as an indicator of website identity. Just as you probably didn't notice that I was showing you a fake Google blog URL, there are lots of users who wouldn't think twice about entering their Google password on a page like this that looks like the real Google login site, but actually says accounts.google-secure.com. They might look at the content area of the page and see that it looks like the real Google sign-in page, and maybe they would glance at the URL bar, and they'd see that it says something legit looking, like accounts in Google and secure, and they'd enter their password, and that would be that. In fact, there are a lot of users who probably wouldn't even think twice about entering their password if the URL bar blatantly said evil.com, because they just wouldn't think to look at the URL bar at all. We know this because of the prevalence of devastating phishing attacks in the wild. Phishing, social engineering are very common avenues of successful exploitation in the real world, and some estimates put the impact of these attacks at billions of dollars per year in the US alone. There are services out there like Google Safe Browsing and Microsoft Smart Screen that try to protect users against these attacks, and they do a great job, but they don't and can't catch all attacks, and the URL is supposed to be our last line of defense. It's supposed to be what URLs can look at, what users can look at to unambiguously tell the identity of the website that they're on. But unfortunately, in the real world, they're just not that effective as a line of defense against these attacks. In this talk, I'm first going to convince you that what we have today for telling users the identity of the website that they're visiting is not working. In the second half of the talk, I'm going to tell you about our approach on the Chrome team to improving this problem. As a spoiler, which I'll give you up front, I'm not going to be presenting a magical silver bullet replacement to URLs. I wish I had that silver bullet, but personally, I don't think it exists. Instead, our approach is to consider many alternatives, different ways to present website identity and related information that can help users make better security decisions. Even though some of these approaches do challenge fundamental rules of usable security, My hope is that by exploring new ideas, even if none of them is a silver bullet replacement for URLs, the aggregate makes for a safer web. And if you develop software that displays URLs to users, or if you're a security researcher who's interested in this area, we want to hear all of your ideas, whether they're incremental or radical, for improving on this problem. So you might be thinking right now, Emily, I think URLs work pretty well. I check the URLs of the website that I visit, and I can tell the difference between accounts.google.com and evil.com. So how do you know that website identity isn't working right now? My conviction about the sorry state of website identity comes from a pretty long line of existing work, as well as some user research and large-scale empirical studies that we've done in Chrome. Together, all of this work tells us three things about URLs. First, users often don't notice them. Even if they do notice them, they often don't understand them or how to make security decisions from them. And finally, sometimes users simply don't have any hope of understanding them because the software doesn't give them correct or enough information. Lots of existing research has suggested that many users simply don't notice browser security indicators like the URL. A 2006 Chi paper found that in their study, 23% of participants didn't look at the browser address bar at all when they were trying to identify fraudulent sites. So this isn't as depressing as it could be. This does mean that some users did look at the URL. But if you think about it, 23%, that's a pretty shockingly high percentage of people who didn't know to even look at the fundamental user-facing security mechanism of the web. And in this scenario, this is a best-case statistic, because in this study, the participants were primed to try to identify fraudulent sites. So the paper predicts that in a more naturalistic scenario, this number might be even higher. We asked ourselves whether some simple UI tweaks are all that we need to do to better draw users' attention to the URL to understand website identity. We performed a survey experiment in which we randomly assigned participants to see one of several different variations on the URL. And these variations ranged from kind of subtle tweaks, as you can see here, just bolding the domain name, to more dramatic variants in which we hid everything except the registerable domain, as you can see at the bottom. And under each of these variations, we asked users how comfortable they would be entering their credentials on this site. Unfortunately, the results were a bit discouraging because we didn't see any statistically significant differences in how users reacted to these different variations. In all the conditions, over half the respondents didn't notice the fishy URL at all. And our attempts to draw attention to the URL by highlighting the domain name didn't have any statistically significant effect. So all this suggests that despite our best efforts, users simply don't notice the URL, or they don't understand what it means and how to make security decisions from it. So that leads into the second problem that we identified with URLs. Oftentimes, even if users notice them, they don't understand them. Of course, some users do understand URLs. I'm sure many of the people in this room do. But even users who have some basic familiarity with URLs and understand the general concepts could easily be tripped up by a tricky URL like one of these, which really requires some pretty advanced internet knowledge to tell whether these are legit or not. And in fact, research has found that even when people are told to specifically look at the URL, it only helps them a little bit in their performance identifying phishing sites. So this suggests that what people are seeing in the URL bar really just isn't very helpful to them as a security mechanism. A final problem that we've identified with URLs is that sometimes they're not displayed properly or with enough information for users to have any hope of understanding them. It turns out that it's really, really hard to write correct code that handles and displays URLs. It's just a complex task. And I'll openly admit, that in Chrome, over the years, we've had dozens of URL display bugs, and some of them have been in security-relevant UI surfaces, including the URL bar. Some of these bugs have made it difficult or sometimes even impossible for users to tell the actual identity of the website that they're visiting. I'd bet that other browsers and other code that handles and displays URLs have had lots of similar bugs too. Or let's look at a specific example. Consider the case of an internationalized domain name, or an IDN. This is a domain that contains some language-specific script or alphabet in it. You can see this is an example of one here. It turns out that IDNs create some complexity because an IDN can sometimes look nearly or exactly indistinguishable from a well-known domain. When this happens, we call it a homograph domain, and when it's used maliciously, we call it a homograph attack. Now, some browsers have a set of heuristics to try to detect when an IDN looks suspiciously similar to a well-known domain. And when this happens, they show this mystifying ASCII encoding called punycode. The problem is, neither of these outcomes are good or reasonable to an average user. We either see this nonsensical punycode that just makes no sense to anyone, or we see a misleading domain that looks exactly like ebay.com. There's just no hope of either of these outcomes being reasonable to any but your most technical user. As a minor detour, I want to point out that many of these problems I'm talking about with URLs are not actually specific to URLs. And in fact, other indicators of website identity suffer from many of the same issues. As an example, consider extended validation certificates, or EV certificates. These are a special type of HTTPS certificate in which the domain owner undergoes some extra validation to tie their public key to a legal entity. And then browsers display this legal entity name in the URL bar. So this is supposed to help users understand the identity of the website that they're visiting. So for example, if a user's on a phishing site, the phishing site wouldn't have an EV certificate for the business that they're trying to attack. So theoretically, a user would notice the lack of EV indicator and thereby detect the phishing attack. Of course, the reality is a bit different. We did a large-scale ablation experiment in which we took a random subset of Chrome users and turned off EV indicators for them. In a wide variety of metrics that we looked at, we couldn't detect any significant difference in user behavior when the EV indicator was supposed to be present but was absent. So this suggests that the EV indicator is suffering from many of the same issues as URLs. Users either don't notice the EV indicator, or lack thereof, or they don't understand what it means and how they should react when it's absent. I kind of expect that you'd get pretty similar results for pretty much any passive indicator of website identity that you could come up with. All this is to say that site identity on the web is not a solved problem. In fact, I might even go so far as to say it's kind of an emergency, because our idea of how users understand site identity is completely and utterly broken. As I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, I'm not going to present a magical silver bullet replacement to URLs that gives websites secure and meaningful names. And I'm certainly not going to do that while preserving a lot of the nice properties of URLs, like the fact that they're decentralized and they allow easy linking and sharing and navigation to content. But I do think that web browsers, as well as app developers and security researchers and other stakeholders in the web, are in a good position to explore incremental approaches that improve the situation. I'm going to talk today about 2 examples of incremental approaches that we're exploring on the Chrome team. These approaches are focused on the latter 2 problems that I identified with URLs, that users often don't understand them, and sometimes they just don't have any hope of understanding them. First, I think it's important that software displays URLs to users as clearly and correctly and understandably as possible. This is sort of something we should do to nail the basics, because otherwise, even experts don't have a hope of determining website identity. As I discussed, this was kind of a persistent problem in Chrome. So we developed and open sourced this tool called Trickery, which you can now find on GitHub. This tool is designed to help software developers test how their code handles weird URL edge cases. It acts as a proxy server and a suite of test cases that allows you to test all sorts of unusual URLs, things like very long URLs, URLs that have RTL components or IDNs, special characters, without setting up live sites for each of them. So if you write software that displays URLs to users, I encourage you to go check out Trickery and use it to test your code. And if you have test cases that you can contribute, we'd love to have those contributions so that others can benefit from them. Alongside Trickery, we wrote up and published this manual for URL display that covers best practices and guidelines that we've built up over the years of working on Chrome. It talks about things like in what context you should display an origin instead of a full URL, what parts of the URL are safe or advisable to omit, how to handle special characters, other cases like that. So we'd really love to have your contributions to this guide, as well as any pull requests that you want to send to Trickery. That said, as I discussed earlier, sometimes displaying a URL correctly in a technical sense is not enough for a user to make sense of it. I talked about this example of IDNs, specifically homograph IDNs that look nearly or exactly identical to a well-known domain. Chrome has a set of heuristics to figure out when an IDN is suspiciously similar to another domain, and we fall back to puny code when those heuristics fire. But based on some of the results that I summarized, I don't think this is a very user-friendly or helpful situation. I suspect that a lot of users faced with this situation where the content area of the website looked like the victim site, the puny code wouldn't really help them out of this attack. At best, it's extremely confusing and user-unfriendly. So we're considering experimenting in Chrome with showing a warning in this situation instead of falling back to puny code. The warning asks users if they'd rather go to the site with which the IDN is confusable. So in this case, the call to action would direct users to the real PayPal.com instead of continuing to an IDN that looks almost or exactly identical to PayPal.com. What's interesting about this warning, in my opinion, is that it's very challenging to design. Normally, we have this design principle in Chrome that we try to kind of stay out of the user's way and let them go about their business. And if we have to get in their face to ask them to make a security decision, we try to have a pretty clear and opinionated message about what they should do. But in this case of these suspicious IDNs, it's not actually so easy to do that all of the time. Consider an IDN like this, which is spoofing Adidas.com, the shoes company. This domain redirects to an Amazon search page for Adidas shoes, and they're presumably doing this to collect an affiliate commission fee. Would you call this an attack? A scam? A trick? Maybe just a clever but misleading way to make money? It's a bit hard to say that it's so scary that we should throw up some big scary warning that really firmly leads the user away from this site. We don't like to scare users unnecessarily. It makes it unpleasant to use the web, and the more kind of big, scary warnings that we throw up in front of users, the more likely they are to get habituated to them and start ignoring them in future. But we did want to decide we want to show something in this case. We think it's better to show an informative UI than either of the alternatives, which would be nonsensical puny code or an extremely misleading domain name. So we're accounting for these tricky gray areas with some careful warning design and analysis. We designed this warning to be informational rather than scary, while still grabbing the user's attention and asking them to make a decision. And we're evaluating the success of this warning by, of course, how many users click through to the real PayPal.com in this case, because that would be a sign that we're helping users out and directing them to where they want to go. But we're also monitoring to make sure that users who don't see this warning get fatigued and start ignoring warnings throughout Chrome. I expect that we'll be experimenting with some more warnings of this general nature in Chrome in future. They're not ideal because they can be ambiguous. They don't always have a clear call to action. But we still think they're better than the status quo of identity on the web. If there's one thing I want you to take away from this talk, it's that website identity is so broken that all ideas should be on the table. If you're a software developer who works on a product that displays URLs to users, I invite you to think very carefully about how you're handling URLs, whether you're handling all the edge cases correctly. And also about whether there's some additional information or clues or hints that you can give to users to help them make security decisions without asking them to rely on the URL alone. And as you're thinking about these things, if you find you have test cases that you can contribute to Trickery or to our URL display guidelines, we'd love to have those contributions. And if you're a researcher or a product person, we want to hear all your ideas, whether they are out of the box or incremental, for how to improve how website identity is communicated to users. Thank you so much to all of you for listening. I want to thank some fantastic coworkers who helped me with this talk, and I'm happy to take any questions.